to Deep Sleep Stories. If these stories have helped you through restless nights, please leave a review. Reviews are what help this podcast grow, reach more listeners, and stay alive. Without them, even something meaningful can slowly disappear. So if this show has brought you comfort, that small act truly helps keep it going. Now, settle in, and let's begin.
Welcome to Deep Sleep Stories, a quiet place where your day can soften at the edges and drift gently away. Tonight, you'll be carried to a lantern-lit harbor where a small dockside concert begins in the hush between tide and starlight. Settle into the shape of rest, exactly as you are. Let your shoulders drop a little, as if a warm hand has reminded them they don't have to hold the world up anymore. Feel the support beneath you. Feel the air around you, calm and patient, with nowhere else to be. Take a slow breath in, as though you're sipping something soothing and warm, and then let it out without effort, like a sigh you don't need to explain. Another breath, unhurried, in and out. Notice how the exhale always knows the way home. As you listen, imagine a coastline at evening, where the sky turns from pale blue to velvet, and the water becomes a mirror that can't quite decide what it wants to reflect. The scent of salt is gentle here, not sharp. The air is cool, not cold. Somewhere very far away, a gull calls once, then quiets, as if it remembers this is a place for sleeping hearts. And with each soft breath, you can let the day loosen, thought by thought, thread by thread, until you are simply floating in the feeling of being safe and still and allowed to rest. Now, without needing to do anything at all, you can let the story begin. There was a harbor town that held its evenings the way a kind person holds a blanket, carefully with warmth, with an understanding that small comforts matter. It was not a famous town. It didn't try to sparkle louder than anywhere else. It simply existed at the edge of the sea, tucked into a crescent of sheltered water, with weathered cottages and softly painted shutters and narrow streets that curved like ribbons. In that town, the docks reached out into the bay with old sturdy planks and low railings, and they creaked sometimes in the way of friendly, familiar things. The wood had been kissed by sun and rinsed by rain, and if you ran your hand along the posts, you might feel tiny grooves where rope had rested for years, and the smoothness left behind by countless tides. On a certain night, one of those nights when the air felt especially gentle, and the sky seemed to lower itself a little closer to the water, people began to wander toward the harbor as if drawn by the same quiet thought. They came slowly, without hurry, in pairs and small groups, or alone with hands tucked into pockets, the way you do when you're content to keep your own company. Lanterns had been hung along the dock, each one a small globe of honeyed light. Their glow rippled across the water in thin, wavering lines, stretching and shrinking with the lazy movement of the tide. The reflections looked like strings of gold drifting just beneath the surface, as if the sea had decided to wear jewelry for the occasion. A little platform had been set up near the end of the dock. Not a stage in any grand sense, just a slightly raised patch of boards, smoothed and swept clean. Someone had placed potted herbs along the edge, thyme and rosemary and mint, their green leaves releasing a soft fragrance whenever the breeze passed through. A few blankets were folded neatly on a bench for anyone who arrived without one, as if the town itself had anticipated every need. The musicians came quietly too. There were 3 of them, and they carried their instruments with the tenderness of people holding something alive. One had a violin in a worn case. Another carried a small wooden flute that gleamed in the lantern light, and the third brought a guitar with a body polished by years of careful hands. They set themselves up without fuss, exchanging smiles that said, "It's a good night for this." No one announced anything. No one clapped loudly to call the evening into order. It was as though the whole gathering understood that the best kind of music begins the way sleep begins, not with a sudden push, but with a gradual settling. On the far side of the bay, boats rocked gently at their moorings. Their masts rose like thin pencils against the deepening sky. Some had small flags that fluttered once and then went still. The boats made tiny knocking sounds as they touched the dock, and the sound felt like a heartbeat you could hear if you listened closely enough. Steady, comforting, unafraid. In one of the cottages that faced the water, a window was open. A warm lamp glowed inside, and the faint scent of baking bread drifted out. Somewhere a kettle whistled briefly and then stopped. These were the small background notes of life, blending into the quiet the way soft percussion blends into a lullaby. Among the people who arrived that evening was a traveler, someone passing through, not quite sure how they'd found their way to this town, and yet feeling as though the town had been waiting. The traveler moved at an easy pace, following the lantern-lit path down to the water. Their footsteps were gentle, their attention soft and open, like a hand held out to receive something delicate. They paused at the start of the dock and looked out across the bay. The water was dark now, but not black, more like ink diluted with moonlight. The sky above held a scatter of stars, and each star seemed to rest in its place as calmly as a pebble at the bottom of a clear stream. The traveler took a breath and felt the way the sea air filled the lungs with coolness and ease. The day they'd carried, whatever it had been, began to feel less heavy. It didn't vanish, not exactly. It simply unfastened itself, like a coat unbuttoned at the end of a long walk. A few steps farther along, the traveler found a spot near the edge of the dock where they could sit. A bench had been placed there, and on it lay one of the folded blankets. The traveler hesitated only a moment before picking it up and draping it over their lap. The fabric was soft, woven thickly, holding the faint scent of lavender and clean cotton. It warmed their legs immediately, as if it carried the memory of sunlight. Around them, the town's people settled in. Some sat on crates turned into stools, others perched on the low railing, feet dangling above the water. A few sat cross-legged on blankets spread across the planks. No one pressed too close. Everyone gave one another the gentle gift of space. The musicians took their places. The guitarist sat on a simple chair, tuning with quiet precision. The violinist lifted their instrument and rested it under the chin, their posture relaxed, their shoulders loose. The flutist held the small wooden flute as if it were a candle they meant to protect from wind. For a moment, there was only the sound of the harbor itself, water shifting against wood, the soft complaint of rope, a distant buoy bell chiming once, then again, patient as breathing. Then the guitarist began to play. It wasn't a song that demanded attention. It didn't arrive with sharp edges or dramatic turns. It unfolded like a ribbon being slowly unspooled, one gentle chord after another, each sound warm and round. The notes fell into the night and seemed to sink into the wood of the dock, into the water, into the air, becoming part of everything. The violin joined next, a long, smooth note that glided above the guitar like a swan across still water. It wasn't sad, it wasn't overly joyful, it was simply tender, as if it understood the secret feelings people carry quietly and never quite name. When the flute finally entered, it did so like a breeze through reeds, a soft, airy melody that lifted and drifted, then hovered. The sound was so light it seemed impossible. It could be made by breath alone, and yet it was. And that made it feel intimate, human, close. The traveler's eyes half closed without any effort. Their body, warmed by the blanket and the closeness of the lanterns, began to relax in small ways. Their jaw unclenched. Their hands rested open in their lap. The muscles at the back of their necks softened, as if they were melting from within. As the music continued, something subtle began to happen in the harbor, something the townspeople didn't seem surprised by, something they welcomed with the calm acceptance of those who know their home well. The water's surface, already shimmering with lantern light, began to sparkle in tiny points that were not reflections. At first, it looked like ripples catching the stars, but then the traveler noticed how the points moved, how they drifted upward and then down again, as if they were small living glimmers. They weren't large, they weren't startling. They were gentle as fireflies, but they lived in the sea, not the air. They rose just above the surface, winked once, and sank again, leaving behind a trail of faint light that vanished. A moment later, the traveler turned their head slightly, looking to see if others noticed. A child nearby leaned forward, smiling, and whispered something to an older person beside them. The older person nodded and wrapped an arm around the child's shoulders. No one pointed, no one exclaimed. The moment was treated like a familiar visitor arriving on time. The traveler let themselves accept it, the way you accept a dream once you're inside it. The harbor was peaceful, and whatever these glimmers were, they belonged to this peace. The music shifted into a new pattern, slower, even more flowing. The guitarist's fingers moved with ease, not rushing, letting each chord breathe before the next arrived. The violin traced a melody that looped and returned, like a path you walk often because it feels safe and known. The flute added little sighing phrases that sounded like the sea exhaling. As the notes drifted out, the glimmers in the water grew a little brighter. Not brighter in a sharp way, but brighter in the way a candle seems brighter when the room is dim. The traveler watched, and their mind began to slow, thoughts spreading out and thinning like clouds. In that softened state, the traveler began to notice details they might have missed otherwise. The way the lantern glass held tiny bubbles, imperfect and charming. The way the dock's boards were worn smooth in the center, but rougher at the edges. The way the air tasted faintly of salt and mint from the potted herbs. A person not far away opened a small tin and offered it around. Inside were simple biscuits, lightly sugared, the kind that crumbled pleasantly. The traveler accepted one with a nod and took a small bite. It tasted like butter and warmth, like kitchens and calm evenings. They chewed slowly, savoring, and then let the sweetness fade on the tongue. Somewhere behind them, someone poured tea into cups. The faint clink of ceramic was soft, almost musical. The scent of chamomile drifted forward. The traveler didn't turn around. They didn't need to. They simply let the sound and scent be part of the gentle tapestry of the night. As the concert continued, the harbor itself seemed to listen. The boats rocked in time, subtle and rhythmic. The ropes creaked as if humming along. Even the distant buoy bell seemed to ring at just the right moments, not interrupting, but adding a low, simple punctuation. The traveler leaned back slightly on the bench. Above, the sky was now fully dark, rich and deep, with stars scattered like seeds. The moon was present, though not full, just enough of it to paint a thin silver path across the water, leading outward toward the unseen horizon, and the glimmers, those sea-born lights, began to gather near the dock, clustering where the music was strongest. They rose and sank as if dancing, their movements slow and careful. The traveler watched them and felt something inside loosen further, as though a knot had been patiently untied. The violin's melody grew a touch more playful, not in a lively, waking way, but in a dreamy way, like a smile you wear in your sleep. The flute answered with a wandering phrase that seemed to curl around the lantern reflections. The guitar held everything steady, like a warm hand at the center of it all. The traveler's eyelids fluttered, then steadied. Their breathing found the same rhythm as the music. In and out. Slow, easy, natural. In the town, there was an old story about the harbor. People said the bay had a memory, not a memory like a mind that thinks, but a memory like a stone holds warmth after a day in the sun. The sea remembered kindness. It remembered songs. It remembered the gentle gatherings that had taken place on these docks over the years. Long ago, when the town had been new and the docks freshly built, sailors had returned from rough waters and hard storms. They'd come home with shoulders tight and eyes tired. The townspeople had welcomed them not with loud celebrations, but with soft music by lantern light, letting the sea and sound together smooth the edges of fear. The old story said that On the calmest nights when the music was just right, the sea would respond. It would send up small lights, little acknowledgments, little blessings, like a quiet thank you from a world that had been listened to. The traveler didn't know the story, not in words, but somehow they felt the truth of it in the way everything aligned so naturally. Nothing here was forcing itself. Nothing was trying too hard. The harbor, the music, the people, the lights, in the water, all of it moved with an easy belonging. A breeze brushed the traveler's cheek, cool and light. It carried the scent of rosemary and salt, and something else, something faintly floral that might have been night-blooming jasmine from a garden somewhere. The traveler pulled the blanket a little higher, not because they were cold, but because the gesture felt comforting, like tucking in. The music shifted again, slower still, the notes lengthening. The violin held a tone that seemed to stretch across the water, a thread of sound connecting dock to horizon. The flute's melody thinned into airy whispers. The guitar's chords became softer, more spaced, as if leaving room for silence to rest between them. The glimmers in the water responded by floating a little higher. For a moment, several hovered at once, suspended just above the surface. They looked like tiny lanterns made of pearl. Then, one by one, they sank back down, leaving behind brief trails that curved and faded like slow-moving comets. The traveler's mind drifted with them, following those fading trails into quietness. Not far away, a small cat padded along the dock, tail held high. It moved with the confidence of a creature that knew it belonged everywhere. It rubbed briefly against a musician's chair leg, then curled up near a warm lantern base, closing its eyes as if the concert had been arranged for its comfort alone. A child yawned and rested their head on a parent's shoulder. The parent didn't shush the child. They simply adjusted a scarf, tucked it around the small neck, and continued listening. Another person leaned back, with hands folded, eyes closed, face soft. The traveler looked at these peaceful scenes as if they were watching a painting slowly come to life. There was no urgency. No one needed to be anything other than what they were in that moment. A listener, a breather, a body becoming still. As the music continued, the traveler began to feel as if the dock itself were a cradle, the steady presence of wood beneath them, the gentle rocking suggestion from the water nearby, the warm lantern light, the slow, steady sounds. All of it made the body feel held. The violinist's bow moved like a slow brush stroke. The flutist's breath was barely visible, yet it carried melody as if the air itself wanted to sing. The guitarist's fingers moved with practiced ease, and each chord felt like a soft footstep across a quiet room. Above them, a thin cloud drifted past the moon, dimming it for a moment and then letting it shine again. The traveler watched the cloud and thought hazily of curtains shifting in a nighttime breeze. The idea was comforting. Everything here moved gently. Nothing snapped or startled. The The glimmers in the water began to form a loose circle near the dock's end. Their faint light traced a shape, never perfectly fixed, always changing. But there was a sense of gathering, of community, as if the sea's little lights had come to listen together. The traveler felt no need to label it, no need to understand. In this softened place, understanding could rest, curiosity could rest, even imagination could rest, because the scene offered itself without requiring anything in return. The music drifted into a piece that felt like a lullaby for the harbor. The melody rose and fell in slow waves, as if it had learned its shape from the tide. It carried a sweetness that wasn't cloying, a warmth that didn't demand. It simply offered. And as it offered, the traveler's thoughts began to thin even more. They thought of the way lantern light looks on water. They thought of warm bread behind an open window. They thought of tea in a cup held between hands. These thoughts weren't sharp. They were soft impressions, like the feeling of a blanket after it's been warmed. The traveler's breathing stayed slow. Their body grew heavier in the best way. The bench beneath them felt more and more supportive, as if it had shifted itself to fit their shape perfectly. The concert continued without any sense of time. It was as though the night had decided to stretch, to become a wide, calm space where nothing needed to end too quickly. At some point, the violin fell quiet, leaving only guitar and flute. The absence of the violin didn't feel like loss. It felt like a door gently closing in a warm house, making the room quieter. The flute's melody became even softer, almost a whisper. The guitar's chords were like slow heartbeats, steady and reassuring. The glimmers in the water responded by dimming slightly, their light becoming more delicate, more inward. They still rose and sank, but now with less display, as if they too were becoming sleepy. The traveler's eyes were mostly closed now. They could still sense the lantern light through their lids, a warm glow. They could still hear the music clearly, but it no longer felt like something outside of them. It felt like something moving through them, smoothing and soothing. The sea air continued to brush the dock. It touched cheeks and hair and hands. It moved through the potted herbs, carrying their scent in little waves. It wrapped around everyone gathered there like a shawl woven from night. In the town behind the harbor, lights and windows began to go out, one by one. Not suddenly, just gradually, as people chose rest. Yet the dock remained softly lit, holding its quiet gathering, as if it were a final, gentle thought before sleep. The musicians played as though they were not performing, but simply breathing music into the night. The sounds were unforced. The pauses between notes grew longer, more spacious. Silence became part of the piece, and the silence felt kind. The traveler, wrapped in the blanket, felt their mind drifting to a place where words were no longer necessary, a place where sensation was enough. Warmth, soft sound, cool air, steady support. The flutist let a final phrase linger, then fade. The guitarist followed with a chord that seemed to settle into the dock's boards and stay there, humming quietly even after the fingers lifted. The music didn't stop so much as it dissolved, like mist dissolving into morning air. Only this was night, and the dissolving led deeper into quiet. No one clapped loudly. A few people brought their hands together softly, more like a gesture of gratitude than applause. Some simply smiled. Some stayed still, as if moving would break the spell. The glimmers in the water rose once more, just a few, winking gently, then sinking, as if curling up in their own hidden beds beneath the surface. The traveler remained seated, not feeling any need to stand. The harbor was quiet now, filled with the soft afterglow of music. The lanterns continued to burn, their light steady, their reflections rippling slowly. The boats rocked. The buoy bell chimed distantly, calm and patient. Someone passed by and placed a hand briefly on the traveler's shoulder, a kind, wordless blessing, then moved on. The traveler's body felt loose and heavy. Their breathing was slow. Their face was soft. Eventually, the travelers and townspeople began to drift away in the same unhurried way they had arrived. Footsteps were quiet on the planks. Voices were murmurs, if they rose at all. The dock seemed to exhale as the gathering thinned, holding the peace like a secret it was happy to keep. The traveler stayed a little longer, watching the lantern reflections, letting the quiet deepen. The blanket over their lap felt warm, as if it had absorbed the light. The air was cool on their skin, pleasant and clean. Above, the stars continued their silent shining. The moon's silver path on the water wavered gently. Everything moved slowly, as if the whole world had decided to speak in whispers. Now the night begins to soften even more. The harbor grows quieter. The lantern light feels farther away, dimmer, gentler. The water's movement becomes a slow, steady lull. The traveler's shoulders sink. Their hands rest easily. Their breath is calm, in and out. The music is gone, but its comfort remains, like warmth in a room after a fire is burned low. The dock holds the last traces of sound in its wood. The sea holds the memory in its dark, kind water. The glimmers beneath the surface settle. The boats continue their slow rocking. The town behind the harbor sleeps. The traveler's eyes stay closed. Their thoughts drift like feathers. Nothing needs to be solved. Nothing needs to be done. Just resting, just floating, just sinking gently into sleep. The way the tide returns to the shore, quietly, surely, without effort. And as the night wraps itself around everything, the harbor becomes a cradle of stillness, and the traveler becomes still within it, safe and warm and sleepy. Good night, dear traveler. Sleep well